I don't care what kind of costume you managed to steal, and I don't care who left the jet bridge door open for you. You do not belong in this cabin. You are certainly not flying this aircraft, and I will not sit here while a man like you pretends to have authority. Get him out of my sight before I call the real authorities and have him arrested for trespassing." The words sliced through the sterile, conditioned air of the first-class cabin of Flight 409, loud enough to stop the boarding process dead in its tracks. Richard Sterling, a man whose bespoke Italian suit and heavy platinum watch signaled a lifetime of unchallenged privilege, stood in the aisle, his finger pointed directly at the chest of a quiet black man. The man being shouted at did not flinch. He did not raise his hands. He did not shout back. He simply stood there, dressed in a standard-issue commercial pilot's shirt, covered by a visibly worn, scuffed leather aviator jacket. His hands remained resting loosely at his sides. His breathing was slow, measured, and completely relaxed. He looked at the screaming billionaire not with anger, but with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a deeply flawed experiment. In exactly 12 minutes, Richard Sterling's entire empire would evaporate, his reputation would be reduced to ash, and the multi-million-dollar logistics company he had built would turn its back on him forever. He was currently screaming at the one man on Earth who held the absolute power to dismantle his life. But to understand how this catastrophic miscalculation happened, and why the man in the scuffed leather jacket refused to break his silence, you have to go back. The air inside Terminal 3 of Chicago's O'Hare International Airport at 3 a.m. has a very specific texture. It is a heavy, cold atmosphere, scented with the sharp, chemical bite of industrial ammonia floor cleaner, the lingering exhausted scent of stale coffee grounds from closed kiosks, and the faint, ever-present toxic perfume of combusted jet fuel seeping through the massive glass windows. For Marcus Vance, this was the smell of his childhood. Marcus was not born into wealth. He was born into the kind of grinding, relentless American poverty that requires a family to operate with military precision just to survive. His mother, Constance Vance, was a night shift custodial worker for Transglobal Airways. For 15 years, while the rest of the city slept, Constance pushed a heavy, roaring rotary floor buffer across millions of square feet of terrazzo tile. She emptied overflowing trash receptacles in the first-class lounges, scrubbed the porcelain sinks of the executive washrooms, and vacuumed the aisles of grounded aircraft, moving like a ghost through the spaces where the world's most powerful people had sat hours before. Because childcare was a luxury the Vance family could not afford, young Marcus spent the majority of his nights sitting in the fluorescent-lit employee break room deep in the bowels of the terminal. He would sit at a scarred plastic table surrounded by the hum of vending machines, completing his middle school math homework while waiting for his mother's shift to end. Constance Vance was a woman of profound, unshakable dignity. Despite the grueling nature of her physical labor, she never allowed her circumstances to dictate her self-worth. Her hands were perpetually cracked from harsh chemicals, and she smelled constantly of cocoa butter and bleach, but her posture was always perfectly straight. It was during one of those long nights when an exhausted 12-year-old Marcus asked her why she bothered to iron her custodial uniform when nobody important ever saw her, that she gave him the internal code that would define the rest of his life. "Dignity isn't a badge they pin on you, Marcus," she had said quietly, folding her rough hands over his math textbook. "It's not a title, and it's not a paycheck. Dignity is the steel in your spine when the world tries to break you. You never let them see you beg. You never let them see you shout, and you never, ever let them convince you that you don't belong in the room. You belong exactly where you stand." Marcus internalized those words. He forged them into armor. That armor carried him out of the south side of Chicago. It carried him through State University on a full academic scholarship and then through the ruthless, hyper-competitive halls of Harvard Business School, where he was often the only black man in his cohort. It carried him through his early 20s on Wall Street, where he learned the brutal mathematics of corporate finance, distressed assets, and hostile takeovers. By the age of 42, Marcus Vance was the founder and majority shareholder of Vanguard Horizon Capital, a private equity firm that specialized in acquiring failing logistics and transportation companies, restructuring them, and returning them to profitability. He was quietly worth over $3 billion. He lived in a sprawling estate in Connecticut, served on the boards of 3 major philanthropic organizations, and had long ago moved his mother into a luxurious, sun-drenched home in Florida before she passed away peacefully in her sleep. Yet despite his immense wealth, Marcus Vance remained intensely private. He did not give interviews to financial magazines, he did not attend celebrity galas, and he maintained a daily grounding ritual that tethered him to his roots. Every single morning, before checking the global markets, Marcus would walk into his state-of-the-art kitchen, bypass the expensive espresso machines, and pour black drip coffee into a chipped, faded ceramic mug, the exact same mug his mother had used in the O'Hare break room decades ago. He also held a commercial pilot's license, a passion he had pursued simply to master the machines his mother had once cleaned. And when he flew, he always wore a specific, battered, leather aviator jacket. The jacket had belonged to his grandfather, a mechanic who had fought for the right to service aircraft during the segregation era. The leather was scuffed at the elbows, the zipper was permanently stiff, and it looked entirely out of place on a billionaire. To Marcus, it was a physical reminder of the blood and sweat that had paid for his presence in the world. For the past 18 months, Marcus and his team of analysts at Vanguard Horizon had been executing a massive, highly classified operation. Transglobal Airways, the very airline his mother had worked for, was on the brink of total financial collapse. Decades of executive mismanagement, bloated contracts, and an aging fleet had pushed the legacy carrier to the edge of bankruptcy. Marcus wasn't going to let it die. Through a series of complex, aggressive financial maneuvers, shell companies, and quiet buyouts of minority shareholders, Vanguard Horizon Capital had systematically acquired a controlling interest in Transglobal Airways. The final, definitive wire transfer, a sum of $1.4 billion, had cleared the Federal Reserve at 4 a.m. this morning. Marcus Vance was now the sole owner of Transglobal Airways. He was scheduled to fly to London that morning to officially terminate the sitting board of directors and announce the acquisition. But true to his nature, Marcus wanted to inspect his new asset from the ground up before the corporate world knew he owned it. He wanted to see the airline the way his mother had seen it, unfiltered, raw, and real. So Marcus dressed in a standard-issue commercial pilot's shirt he had acquired during his training, slipped his grandfather's worn leather jacket over his shoulders, and headed to John F. Kennedy International Airport. He had no idea that he was about to collide with Richard Sterling. Richard Sterling lived in a completely different universe. He was the CEO of Sterling Global Freight, a massive shipping and logistics empire. If Marcus's world was defined by quiet discipline, Richard's world was defined by loud, aggressive entitlement. Richard's mornings did not begin with a chipped mug. They began with a personal trainer, a glass of expensive cold-pressed juice, and the absolute certainty that the rules of society did not apply to him. He was a man who measured his worth by the visible submission of others. He regularly berated valets, screamed at executive assistants, and viewed anyone making less than $1 million a year as an NPC, a non-player character in the video game of his life. Sterling Global Freight held a massive, lucrative $180 million annual contract with Transglobal Airways to utilize the lower cargo holds of their international passenger flights. Because of this contract, Richard Sterling viewed the airline as his personal property. He held diamond executive status, meaning he demanded the highest level of groveling from the airline staff. On this particular morning, Richard was already furious. His private driver had hit traffic on the way to JFK, the VIP lounge had run out of his preferred brand of imported sparkling water, and the stock market was opening down. By the time he walked down the jet bridge to board Transglobal Flight 409 to London Heathrow, he was looking for a target to absorb his rage. He was about to find one. The first-class cabin of a Boeing 777 flying a transatlantic route is designed to mimic a luxury hotel. The air smells faintly of lavender and warm linen. The seats are wrapped in rich, supple cream leather. The lighting is heavily controlled, bathing the cabin in a soft, golden, ambient glow designed to soothe the nerves of the ultra-wealthy. It is an exclusive space, a white-coated space, a space where admission costs the equivalent of a working-class family's annual mortgage payment. At 7:45 a.m., Marcus Vance was standing in the forward galley of this cabin. He was running his hand along the seam of the bulkhead, noting the slightly peeling laminate near the espresso maker. He was mentally calculating the cost of a fleet-wide interior refurbishment. His worn leather jacket squeaked slightly as he moved. He looked entirely peaceful. At 7:46 a.m., Richard Sterling stormed onto the aircraft. Richard's heavy leather briefcase banged against the doorframe as he entered. He scowled at the greeting flight attendant, ignoring her welcoming smile entirely. He turned the corner into the first-class galley, heading for seat 1A, and stopped dead in his tracks. He saw Marcus. Richard's eyes immediately scanned the visual data before him. He saw a black man. He saw a faded, scuffed leather jacket. He saw cracked, worn boots. In Richard Sterling's heavily conditioned, prejudiced mind, the algorithmic calculation was instantaneous and absolute. This man is poor. This man is staff. This man does not belong here. Richard assumed Marcus was a baggage handler who had stolen a pilot's shirt to keep warm, or a rogue catering employee snooping through the liquor cabinets. The idea that this man could be a legitimate pilot, let alone a passenger, never even entered the stratosphere of his consciousness. "Excuse me," Richard snapped, his voice sharp and dripping with immediate contempt. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Marcus paused his inspection of the bulkhead. He turned his head slowly, his expression entirely neutral. He looked at Richard, noting the red flush of anger creeping up the man's neck, the expensive but poorly tied silk tie, the scent of expensive bourbon masking morning breath. "I am inspecting the cabin," Marcus said. His voice was low, rich, and calm. The calm tone infuriated Richard. It lacked the subservience he expected, demanded, and required from people he deemed beneath him. "You're inspecting the cabin?" Richard scoffed, letting out a harsh, barking laugh that echoed down the aisle. "You're a baggage thrower, or a janitor. Look at your jacket. You look like you slept under a bridge. Get out of the first-class galley immediately. I want a pre-departure beverage, and I don't want you breathing on the glassware." Marcus did not blink. He did not move. He simply stared at Richard, the silence stretching between them like a physical weight. "Dignity is the steel in your spine." "I am perfectly authorized to be exactly where I'm standing, sir," Marcus said, his voice dropping an octave, settling into a tone of absolute, unbreakable bedrock. "I suggest you take your seat." The audacity of the response struck Richard like a physical blow. A vein began to pulse visibly on the side of his neck. The boarding process was continuing, and several other wealthy passengers were beginning to file into the first-class cabin. A woman in a Chanel suit, clutching a designer handbag, paused in the aisle. She looked at Marcus, then at Richard, and quickly averted her eyes, sliding into seat 2B and immediately hiding behind her tablet. Complicity in silence. A middle-aged tech executive in seat 3A slowly pulled out his smartphone, resting it on his knee, the red recording light blinking. He was eager to capture the confrontation for social media, eager to consume the trauma, but he made no move to intervene. Complicity in observation. "Authorized?" Richard yelled, his voice now echoing loudly enough that passengers in the economy cabin began to crane their necks. "You people are unbelievable. You always think the rules don't apply to you. You think you can just walk into spaces built for us, put on a stolen pilot's shirt, and pretend you're somebody. I know exactly what you are. You're a thief, and you're trespassing." At that moment, a junior flight attendant named Maria rushed forward from the aft galley. Maria was 23 years old. She had grown up in Queens, paid her own way through college, and had been on the job for exactly 4 months. She was terrified, her hands shaking slightly, but she stepped directly between the billionaire and Marcus. "Sir," Maria said, her voice trembling but resolute, "please lower your voice. This gentleman is not doing anything wrong. I need to ask you to take your seat so we can complete the boarding process." Richard turned his fury onto Maria. He leaned forward, his face inches from hers, using his physical size to intimidate her. "Listen to me, you little glorified waitress," Richard spat, the smell of his breath washing over her. "My name is Richard Sterling. I am the CEO of Sterling Global Freight. My company spends $180 million a year to keep this garbage airline afloat. I practically pay your salary. If you do not have this street thug removed from this aircraft immediately, I will personally ensure that you are fired, blacklisted, and scrubbing toilets by tomorrow morning." Maria stood her ground. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to Marcus, who gave her a nearly imperceptible nod of gratitude. "Sir, I will not remove him," Maria said clearly. "He has a right to be here." Richard's face contorted into an ugly, sneering mask. "Fine, I'll handle it myself." He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and dialed a number. "Get me the Port Authority police and the gate supervisor at B14 now. We have a hostile trespasser in the cockpit area. A black male, wearing a fake uniform, refusing to leave the aircraft. Yes, I'll hold." Richard ended the call and glared triumphantly at Marcus. "You're going out of here in handcuffs, boy." Throughout the entire tirade, Marcus Vance had not reacted emotionally. He had not raised his voice to defend his honor. He had not frantically tried to explain his credentials. He had simply stood there, absorbing the assault, letting Richard Sterling construct his own inescapable trap. Marcus slowly reached into the pocket of his worn leather jacket. The tech executive in 3A flinched, as if expecting a weapon. Marcus pulled out his smartphone. He opened a secure messaging application, clicked on a contact named David Pierce, Chief Counsel, Vanguard Horizon, and typed a single, perfectly punctuated message. "Richard Sterling is on Flight 409. He has aggressively harassed crew and demonstrated gross racial prejudice publicly. Execute the moral turpitude termination clause on the Sterling Global Freight contract. Nullify it immediately. Make it irreversible." He pressed send. He then typed a second message to Thomas Blake, the incoming vice president of operations for Transglobal Airways, who was waiting at the gate to brief Marcus before takeoff. "Thomas, board the aircraft. Bring the police." Marcus slid the phone back into his pocket. He looked at Richard Sterling, who was standing with his arms crossed, looking incredibly pleased with himself. "The police are on their way," Richard sneered. "Any last words before you're dragged out of here?" Marcus looked at the billionaire. He noticed the slight tremor of adrenaline in the man's hands, the desperate need for dominance that radiated from his pores. "No," Marcus said softly, his voice barely a whisper against the hum of the aircraft's auxiliary power unit. "I think you have said quite enough for both of us." 6 minutes later, the heavy thud of combat boots echoed down the jet bridge. 2 Port Authority police officers, hands resting casually on their duty belts, stepped onto the aircraft. They looked tense, their eyes scanning the cabin for the reported hostile trespasser. Behind them, visibly out of breath and sweating profusely, was Thomas Blake, the newly appointed VP of Operations. Thomas was carrying a thick, leather-bound portfolio of legal documents. Richard Sterling immediately puffed out his chest and stepped forward, waving his hand like a traffic cop. "Officers, right here," Richard commanded, pointing at Marcus. "This man is an imposter. He sneaked onto the aircraft, he's harassing the crew, and he's refusing to leave. I want him arrested for trespassing and corporate espionage." The 2 police officers looked at Marcus. They saw the calm demeanor, the steady stance, the complete lack of aggression. They paused, trained to read body language, sensing that the situation did not match the frantic 911 call. Before the officers could speak, Thomas Blake pushed past them. Thomas ignored the police. He completely ignored Richard Sterling. He walked directly to Marcus Vance, stopped, and bowed his head slightly in a gesture of profound, professional respect. "Mr. Vance," Thomas said, his voice loud, clear, and carrying perfectly through the deadly quiet cabin. "I apologize for the delay. The final federal filings went through at 8:02 a.m. The wire transfer is fully settled. I have the finalized documents right here." Thomas extended his hand. Marcus shook it warmly. "Welcome to your airline, sir," Thomas said. "You now own Transglobal Airways." The silence that fell over the first-class cabin was absolute. It was not just quiet. It was a physical vacuum, a sudden removal of all oxygen from the room. The only sound was the faint, rhythmic ping of a seatbelt sign turning on. The woman in the Chanel suit dropped her tablet. It clattered loudly against the plastic tray table. The tech executive in seat 3A lowered his phone, his mouth falling open in genuine shock. Richard Sterling stopped breathing. His brain simply could not process the data it was receiving. He stared at Thomas Blake, then at the thick legal portfolio, and finally at Marcus Vance. The worn leather jacket suddenly didn't look poor. It looked like the eccentric armor of a man who held so much power he didn't need to dress up for anyone. What is this?" Richard stammered, his voice suddenly sounding remarkably small, high-pitched, and fragile. "Thomas, what is this nonsense? Who is this man?" Thomas Blake finally turned to look at Richard. His expression was a mixture of pity and extreme discomfort. "Mr. Sterling," Thomas said carefully, "this is Marcus Vance, founder and CEO of Vanguard Horizon Capital. As of this morning, Vanguard Horizon has acquired a 100% controlling stake in Transglobal Airways. Mr. Vance is the sole owner of this company, this aircraft, and every employee on it." The physical deterioration of Richard Sterling was spectacular to witness. The angry, flushed red color drained from his face so rapidly he appeared to turn a sickly, translucent gray. The rigid posture of his shoulders collapsed, leaving him suddenly looking old and incredibly soft. His knees buckled slightly, forcing him to grip the back of seat 1B to keep from falling over. The heavy gold Rolex on his wrist suddenly looked like an anchor dragging him to the bottom of the ocean. He had just publicly racially abused a billionaire in the center of his own multi-million-dollar asset. "Mr. Vance!" Richard choked out, his throat dry. He attempted to force a smile onto his face, a grotesque, panic-stricken grimace. There has been a terrible misunderstanding. I was just concerned about security. You understand, right? In this day and age, it was a simple mistake. Let me buy you a drink in London. We do a lot of business together. My freight contract." Marcus Vance finally moved. He took one single step forward. He did not raise his hands. He did not clench his fists. He He simply invaded Richard's personal space with the quiet, terrifying gravity of a black hole. "There is no misunderstanding," Marcus said. His voice was no longer soft. It was a precise, devastating instrument, echoing with the moral authority of generations of endurance. "You walked onto my aircraft," Marcus began, looking directly into Richard's panicked eyes. "You stood on carpet my company paid for. You breathed air my engines conditioned. You enjoyed a status that my corporation provided to you. And when you saw a black man standing in a space you believed belonged exclusively to you, the very first thing you did was attempt to strip him of his humanity." Richard tried to speak, to interrupt, but Marcus's voice cut through him like a scalpel. "You didn't ask a question. You made an accusation," Marcus continued, his words landing like hammer strikes. "You humiliated a young woman who was simply doing her job. You invoked the police as a weapon to enforce your prejudice. You looked at my skin, you looked at my grandfather's coat, and you decided that I had no value." The cabin was entirely transfixed. Even the police officers stood frozen, captivated by the absolute destruction occurring before them. "I didn't yell at you, Richard," Marcus said softly, the contrast making the words hit harder. "I didn't threaten you. I didn't defend myself. I just let you show everyone exactly who you are." Marcus turned to Thomas Blake. "Thomas," Marcus said, "what time is it?" Thomas looked at his watch. "It is 8:14 a.m., sir." Marcus turned back to Richard. "At 8:12 a.m., my legal counsel executed the moral turpitude clause embedded in Section 4 of your freight contract," Marcus stated factually. "Sterling Global Freight is no longer authorized to load cargo onto any transglobal aircraft, effective immediately. That is $180 million in logistics capacity that you no longer possess. Good luck explaining that to your shareholders when the market opens." Richard gasped, a wet, ragged sound. "You can't do that. You'll bankrupt my company. You'll destroy me." Marcus looked at him with zero empathy. "You destroyed yourself," Marcus replied. "You just didn't know I had the authority to process the paperwork." Marcus then turned his attention to the two Port Authority officers. "Officers," Marcus said respectfully, "this man is creating a hostile environment for my crew. I am officially denying him boarding. Please remove him from my property." The officers, recognizing lawful authority when they heard it, stepped forward immediately. They flanked Richard Sterling, grabbing him by his expensive tailored arms. "Sir, you need to come with us right now," the taller officer commanded. Wait, please. Mr. Vance, let's talk about this. I have a diamond medallion." "You can't just throw me off," Richard shrieked, all his dignity evaporating as he desperately clawed at the doorway. He was dragged backward down the jet bridge, his frantic apologies echoing loudly, fading away into the sterile terminal, until finally the heavy metal door of the aircraft was sealed shut, locking him out of the world he thought he owned. Inside the cabin, the heavy silence returned. Marcus took a slow, deep breath, smoothing the front of his grandfather's leather jacket. He turned to look at the terrified passengers. He looked at the woman who had hidden behind her iPad and the man who had recorded the entire incident. "For those of you who sat in silence while a man was humiliated," Marcus said, his voice completely devoid of judgment but heavy with disappointment, "I hope you enjoy your flight. For your sake, I hope you never find yourselves in a room where someone decides you don't belong and nobody speaks up for you." He then turned to Maria, the young flight attendant who was still standing by the galley partition, tears welling in her eyes. Marcus smiled for the first time that morning. It was a warm, genuine smile. "Maria," Marcus said gently. "What is your last name?" "Thorne, sir," she whispered. "Well, Ms. Thorne," Marcus said, "as of right now, you are no longer a junior flight attendant. You are the new Director of Corporate Culture and Employee Advocacy for Transglobal Airways. You will report directly to my office in New York. I want you to teach every single person in this company how to have the courage you just showed." Maria covered her mouth, a sob of relief and shock escaping her lips. Marcus nodded to her, turned, and walked quietly toward the cockpit to prepare for takeoff. The destruction of Richard Sterling was absolute, quantified, and entirely procedural. The tech executive, in seat 3A, did eventually post the video to social media. He did not frame himself as a hero, but simply captioned it. "A billionaire picked a fight with the wrong man today." The video accumulated 40 million views in 48 hours. The financial markets reacted with brutal efficiency. When news broke that Vanguard Horizon had terminated the $180 million transglobal freight contract due to the CEO's racial outburst, investors panicked. Sterling Global Freight relied heavily on those European cargo routes to fulfill their supply chain obligations. Without them, their logistics network faced catastrophic delays. By Tuesday afternoon, the stock price of Sterling Global Freight plummeted by 32%. On Wednesday morning, the board of directors of Sterling Global held an emergency session. They did not care about Richard's soul, but they cared deeply about their fiduciary duty. By a unanimous vote, Richard Sterling was stripped of his title as chief executive officer, forced to surrender his stock options, and removed from the company he had built. He was placed on the permanent no-fly list of Transglobal Airways and, subsequently, 3 other major carriers who adopted the policy in solidarity. He lost his company, his status, and his mobility in exactly 72 hours. But justice in Marcus Vance's world was not just about destroying bad men. It was about building a structure that protected good people. Within his first 30 days as owner, Marcus implemented sweeping changes across Transglobal Airways. He instituted a zero-tolerance policy for passenger abuse against staff, backed by aggressive legal representation funded by the company. He also created a $10 million annual educational endowment for the children of the airline's janitorial and ground support staff. He named it the Constance Vance Scholarship Fund. 6 months after the incident on Flight 409, Marcus Vance was sitting on the back porch of his Connecticut estate. The afternoon sun was golden and warm, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. He was dressed in jeans and a simple cotton t-shirt. Sitting next to him was his 7-year-old daughter, Maya. She was drawing in a sketchbook, humming softly to herself. Marcus watched her for a moment. He reached over to the small wrought iron table beside him and picked up his mother's chipped, faded ceramic mug, taking a slow sip of black coffee. "Daddy?" Maya asked, looking up from her drawing. "Why do you always drink out of that broken cup? We have really nice glasses inside." Marcus smiled. He set the mug down and gently touched his daughter's shoulder. "Because, Maya," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying the weight of generations, "it reminds me that the most valuable things in the world don't always look shiny on the outside. And it reminds me to always remember where I came from." Maya nodded, accepting the wisdom with a child's simplicity, and went back to her drawing. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the warm sun hitting his face, completely at peace. "What would you have done if you were sitting in seat 2, B, or 3A, watching a man be systematically dehumanized because of his race, his clothing, and the assumptions made about his worth? Would you have spoken up, or would you have hidden behind your screen, waiting to see how the conflict resolved before taking a side? The core injustice of this story isn't that Richard Sterling was a racist. The core injustice is that he felt so comfortable, so deeply supported by the silence of the room, that he believed his racism was a legitimate enforcement of the social order. He didn't fear consequence because he had spent a lifetime in a system that rewarded his entitlement. Marcus Vance won because he had the hidden power of a billionaire. But a person's right to exist in a space, their right to breathe the air, and their right to be treated with basic human respect should never require a billion-dollar bank account. It shouldn't require owning the airplane to be treated like a human being on it. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with someone who might be struggling, someone who feels like they don't belong in the room they are standing in, and subscribe to keep following these true stories of dignity and consequence. Dignity doesn't need a heavy platinum watch or a tailored suit. It just needs the steel in your spine. Remember that